He was the devil everyone feared, until one stormy night, a broken cry from a dark alley made the Mafia Boss drop his gun and pick up a bleeding little girl instead. What began as an act of mercy soon turned into a war between his heart and his past. But when the same girl grows into the only person who can save him from himself, love becomes the most dangerous crime of all. Before we dive into today's heart-wrenching story, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Rain wept from the heavens like a punishment that night, soaking the crooked streets of the city that had long forgotten mercy. The alley reeked of despair, littered with broken bottles, flickering neon reflections, and a silence that screamed louder than thunder. Amid that silence lay a small body, Amara, 6 years old, bruised and trembling, her torn dress clinging to her fragile frame as if even fabric feared to leave her alone. The storm drowned out her sobs, but the world didn't need to hear. It had never listened anyway. Her aunt's gambling debt had stolen not only her innocence, but her will to live, leaving her crumpled beside an overturned trash bin. Yet somewhere in the shadows, fate waited in the form of Lorenzo De Luca, a name that made grown men tremble, a man whose empire was built on fear, silence, and blood. Tonight, he wasn't there to save anyone. He had come to collect a debt, a final warning to a fool who dared cross him. His shoes splashed through puddles as lightning flared above, his men trailing close, guns holstered but ready. He didn't notice the small body at first. He never looked down. The world beneath him had never mattered. But when a faint, broken whimper cracked through the storm, something ancient and buried deep inside him stirred. He turned. A flash of lightning illuminated the girl's face, blood-matted hair, a cheek swollen, eyes half open yet fading. She wasn't just hurt, she was destroyed. For the first time in years, Lorenzo froze. His men muttered behind him, "Boss, we should go." But his silence was deafening. His mind, usually sharp as a blade, sank into chaos. Memories he'd buried under layers of violence and money surged back. His little sister, Lucia, who had died on a night like this, begging for help he hadn't been able to give. His throat tightened, his jaw locked, and his heartbeat, once steady as a gun, stumbled. He knelt down, the rain mixing with the blood on her skin, and for a moment the Mafia Boss vanished, leaving only a man haunted by the ghost of who he used to be. "Who did this to you?" he muttered, his voice trembling with a rage he didn't understand. The girl's lips moved faintly, but no words came, only a soft cry, too fragile for this cruel city. Without thinking, Lorenzo took off his jacket, wrapping it around her small frame, ignoring the stains that would never wash out. His men exchanged glances, confused. This wasn't their boss, the ruthless, untouchable De Luca who would shoot a man for hesitation. "Boss, leave her," one of them dared to say. Lorenzo's glare was enough to silence him for life. "Touch her," he growled, "and you die." He lifted her into his arms, her head falling weakly against his chest. The weight of her was nothing, and everything. As he carried her through the rain, flashes of his past bled into the present. Lucia's pale face, the sirens, his helplessness. He had sworn never to feel again. But here he was, heart pounding, jaw clenched, protecting a stranger like she was the last piece of his soul. They reached his car, a sleek black beast waiting in the storm. "To Dr. Marino," he ordered, his voice steel over trembling. His men hesitated. It was dangerous to bring anyone to their inner circle. "Now," he barked, slamming the door behind him. The car tore through the rain, and Lorenzo stared at the girl in his lap, her small hand twitching against his shirt, smearing crimson lines across his chest. She was slipping away, and every second tore at something he thought was long dead. "Hold on," he whispered, his tone softer than rain. "You're safe now." The hospital lights hit like daggers when they burst through the doors of his private clinic. "She's just a kid!" Lorenzo roared when the doctor hesitated. The old man, used to treating bullet wounds and mob injuries, stared at the fragile child, uncertain what to do. Lorenzo's fury erupted. "Save her!" His fist slammed into the wall. The doctor nodded, rushing her inside. Time dissolved. Minutes became hours. The boss who commanded armies now sat alone, drenched, silent, staring at the blood that wasn't his. His reflection in the window looked nothing like a king. It looked like a man damned by regret. He remembered Lucia again, remembered her tiny voice whispering, "Please don't leave me." And he clenched his fists until his knuckles bled. When Dr. Marino returned, his face was grave. "She's alive," he said, "but barely. She needs rest and hope." Lorenzo stepped closer, staring through the glass at her small body connected to wires and machines. Hope, a word he'd buried years ago. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed. Hours passed. The city never slept, but he didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, her fingers twitching, her lips trembling. When dawn began to break through the blinds, her eyelids fluttered open. Her gaze found him. Stormy eyes meeting eyes that had seen too much darkness. And then, in a voice softer than a prayer, she whispered, "Please, don't leave me." Something inside Lorenzo shattered completely. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers trembling. "I'm here," he whispered, his throat thick. Her grip tightened weakly before her eyes rolled back, the machine screaming as her body went limp again. Panic rushed through him, the same helplessness clawing at his chest like it had years ago. The doctor stormed in, shouting orders, but Lorenzo stood frozen, staring at her small hand slipping from his. He had seen death countless times, but this was different. This was the universe reminding him that all his power meant nothing against fate. As the medical team worked, he turned away, his heart hammering, rage and guilt twisting together until they felt the same. Outside, thunder rolled again as if echoing his soul. For the first time in years, the Mafia Boss felt fear. Not of death, not of enemies, but of losing the only pure thing he'd ever found. He clenched his fists, his voice a vow to the night. "If she lives, I'll burn the world to keep her safe." Dr. Marino emerged moments later, face pale and trembling. "Boss," he said quietly, "if she doesn't wake up by morning, she'll never wake up again." The night stretched endlessly, the rain outside reduced to a mournful drizzle that whispered against the window panes as if the heavens themselves were praying for the fragile girl lying motionless on the bed. Lorenzo hadn't moved in hours. His tailored suit clung to him, still damp from the storm, but he didn't notice. His eyes were locked on the small hand resting beside the white sheet, the same hand that had clung to his like it was her lifeline before falling into silence. Each faint beep of the heart monitor felt like a countdown he couldn't control, and for the first time in years, the Mafia Boss who ruled the underworld like a god found himself powerless. Around him, the room smelled of antiseptic and fear, the air so heavy it could crush the soul. His mind replayed her weak whisper, "Please don't leave me." A plea that kept echoing through the corridors of his chest, ripping open wounds he thought had healed decades ago. He wasn't supposed to feel this. Feelings were for the weak, for those who didn't have blood on their hands. Yet here he was, fingers trembling as he brushed a lock of hair from her forehead, a gesture that didn't belong to a man like him. His men had left hours ago, too afraid to disturb their boss, leaving only him, the hum of machines, and the ghost of his sister's memory pacing in his mind. The clock struck 3, then 4, time dragging its chains, and still, he didn't blink. When her small hand twitched, he froze. The world narrowed into a single heartbeat. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, two pools of confusion and innocence staring into his cold blue ones. For a moment neither spoke. Then, with a weak voice that trembled like a whisper caught in wind, she murmured, "Papa?" The word stabbed through his chest, sharp and pure, breaking the armor he had built around his heart. "Papa!" No one had called him that. No one had ever dared. His breath hitched as he leaned forward, the corner of his mouth trembling in disbelief. "No, you've got the wrong man," he managed, but his voice betrayed him. She smiled faintly, tears glistening on her lashes, as if she saw through the mask he wore better than anyone ever had. Something inside him gave way, a dam collapsing under the weight of emotions too long denied. He reached out, his hand hovering above hers before finally closing around it. "Rest now," he said softly, a tone his men had never heard from him. you're safe." And for the first time in years, he meant it. He stayed by her side as the morning sun crept through the blinds, painting gold lines across her fragile face. The light didn't belong in his world, but somehow it found him there. The doctor entered quietly, astonished. "She's a miracle, Lorenzo," he whispered. "She survived because someone refused to let go." Lorenzo didn't answer. His gaze remained on her. Deep down, something irreversible had begun. Later that day, as she slept peacefully, he stood by the window, staring out at the city that bowed to his power yet mocked his humanity. This world doesn't deserve her, he thought. And from that moment, a decision took root. He would protect her, not as a gangster guarding an asset, but as a man guarding the last piece of goodness left in him. He ordered new security systems installed at the villa, doubled the guards, and quietly instructed his men that the girl's existence was to remain secret. "No one touches her. No one even says her name," he said coldly, his tone enough to make even his most loyal soldier swallow hard. But in the underworld, rumors travel faster than bullets. Whispers spread that Lorenzo de Luca, the untouchable king, had gone soft, that a little girl had become his weakness. Rival families laughed behind closed doors, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At his mansion that night, while the girl rested in a guest room guarded by armed men, Lorenzo sat alone in his study, the glow of his cigar dying in the ashtray. He couldn't shake the image of her calling him Papa. It played on repeat, mingling with old guilt, softening something he didn't want softened. "You're slipping, boss," he muttered to his reflection in the glass, seeing not a feared man, but one haunted by innocence. Just then the door opened quietly. His right-hand man, Marco, stepped in, his expression grave, hat still dripping from rain. Lorenzo didn't turn, his voice steady but low. "What is it?" Marco hesitated, swallowing hard before speaking. "Boss?" His tone carried a weight Lorenzo instantly recognized, fear mixed with urgency. "Someone's talking," Marco said. "They say the girl's alive, and valuable." Lorenzo's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as a dangerous silence filled the room. "Valuable to who?" he asked slowly. Marco exhaled, voice breaking slightly. "Viktor Malenkov's men. Word is, someone just put a bounty on the girl." Lorenzo's glass shattered in his hand, blood dripping down his knuckles as he whispered through clenched teeth. "Then they just signed their death warrant." The night broke into chaos before the moon could even rise. The silence around Lorenzo's mansion was sliced apart by the echo of engines and the faint crunch of gravel under boots that didn't belong there. Inside, the atmosphere was calm, almost deceptive. Amara slept soundly in her new room, clutching a stuffed bear Lorenzo's men had awkwardly bought from a street vendor that morning, while Lorenzo reviewed documents in his dimly lit study, cigar smoke curling like ghosts above his head. The first bullet shattered a window upstairs, followed by the unmistakable staccato of gunfire. Instinct took over. Lorenzo's cigar dropped, his chair toppled, and within seconds, the mansion became a war zone. "They're here for the girl!" Marco yelled from the hallway, as glass exploded and alarms screamed. Lorenzo's heart seized, not with fear, but with a surge of savage fury that reminded every cell in his body who he truly was. He grabbed his gun from the drawer, eyes blazing, and roared orders to his men. "Protect her! No one touches that child!" The mansion, a palace of marble and blood money, transformed into a battlefield. Shadows moved behind curtains, gunfire echoed against the marble floors, and screams twisted into the air. Lorenzo stormed into the corridor, firing 2 shots into the masked men climbing the stairs. Blood sprayed the walls. One fell backward over the railing, crashing onto the piano in the foyer below. Amara woke to the chaos, trembling, her small voice breaking through the gunfire. "Papa!" He heard it, his world condensed into that single cry. "Amara, stay down!" he shouted, running through smoke and glass toward her room. She had crawled out of bed, barefoot, Terrified, clutching her bear as bullets ripped through the walls, Marco grabbed her, dragging her behind the grand piano in the hall. The sound of ricocheting bullets thundered around them as the child wept, covering her ears, whispering prayers she barely remembered. Lorenzo burst through the main hallway, his movements sharp, precise, inhumanly fast. Rage burned in his veins like gasoline. For every man who stepped into his home, he took two down. The chandelier above shattered, raining shards of crystal and fire, lighting his face in flashes of gold and crimson. The enemy underestimated him. They came for a child, but they awakened the devil who built an empire from nothing but blood and vengeance. "Who sent you?" he barked, slamming one of the attackers against the wall, his voice a thunderclap of rage. The man's silence earned him a single bullet to the chest. By the time the last body hit the ground, the mansion smelled of gunpowder and death. Smoke coiled through the hallways, dancing around the piano where Amara sobbed. Lorenzo dropped his gun, breathing hard. His once immaculate shirt soaked in blood, some his, most not. He crossed the ruined marble floor and knelt beside her, hands shaking not from exhaustion, but from the realization that he had almost lost her. "You're safe," he whispered, wiping tears from her cheek, his voice trembling despite his strength. "It's over." But even as he said the words, he knew it wasn't. Not until he knew who dared invade his world for her. He stood, eyes cold again, and barked, "Find out who paid for this!" His men, bloodied but loyal, nodded and began moving bodies, searching for insignias, tattoos, anything that might trace the attack back. Hours later, Lorenzo sat in the wreckage of his study, staring at bullet holes that scarred his walls like memories that would never fade. Marco returned, face grim. "We found their source, boss," he said quietly. "They weren't freelancers. They worked for Victor Malenkov." The name hit Lorenzo like ice water. Victor, his oldest enemy, the man who had once tried to steal his empire and failed. "Why her?" Lorenzo demanded, pacing, fury twisting in every breath. Marco hesitated, holding out a crumpled file recovered from one of the dead men's pockets. Inside was a torn document bearing Amara's name and her aunt's signature. Lorenzo's jaw clenched as he read the words that made his stomach twist. Debt settled in exchange for child. His fingers crushed the paper until it tore. "She sold her," he whispered, disbelief giving way to a violent tremor of rage. His mind painted the image of that broken little girl lying in the alley, abandoned because of money, because someone she trusted treated her like a token to gamble away. His chest heaved, his soul burned. For a man who had killed hundreds, this was the first time in years he felt something close to tears. "Get me Victor's location," he ordered through gritted teeth. "If he thinks I'll hand her over, he doesn't know the meaning of fear." He walked to the window, staring out at the night sky now heavy with clouds again, lightning crawling along the horizon, like veins of fire. In that reflection, he didn't see a man anymore. He saw a monster reborn, one with a cause. Somewhere deep down, he realized he wasn't just protecting Amara. He was redeeming the ghost of his sister, righting a cosmic wrong that had stolen his heart years ago. But the storm outside wasn't done with him yet. The phone on his desk buzzed, a secure line only used by those who knew how to die properly if they crossed him. Lorenzo picked it up, silent, waiting. The voice on the other end was smooth, cold, familiar. "You've made a mistake, DeLuca," Victor said, his Russian accent dripping with venom. "You took something that belongs to me." Lorenzo's lip curled. "She's a child, not a pawn." Victor chuckled darkly. "Everything in this world has a price, even innocence. Bring me the girl, or your empire burns." Lorenzo stared at the shattered glass on his desk, voice low and deadly, as he whispered to the night, "Then let it burn." Lorenzo DeLuca had dealt with monsters his entire life, but none as dangerous as the feeling that began to twist inside him the moment Victor's message burned across his phone screen. "Bring me the girl, or your empire burns." Those words should have chilled him into obedience, but instead, they ignited something ancient and defiant. He stared at the message for a long moment, then crushed the phone in his gloved fist, shards cutting into his palm as blood dripped down his wrist. "No one touches her," he growled, voice low and deadly, a promise echoing in the silence. That night, while the city slept beneath thunderclouds, Lorenzo set Victor's drug warehouse ablaze himself. He stood before the roaring inferno, rain mixing with sweat and soot, watching flames devour crates of poison that had ruined countless lives, including the one that nearly destroyed Amara's. His men watched from afar, uneasy. None dared question his madness when the warehouse exploded behind him, lighting the sky crimson. Lorenzo walked away without looking back, leaving the ashes as his answer to Victor's threat. The fire reflected in his eyes as if it had burned into his soul, a fire born not of crime or vengeance, but of something far more dangerous: love. He moved Amara that same night to a secret villa hidden beyond the northern cliffs, a place known only to him and a handful of his most trusted guards. The mansion was surrounded by silence and mist, where the ocean met the rocks below like a restless beast. Here, no one could find her. For days, she slept in peace for the first time, her tiny hands clutching the same toy he'd bought her from a street fair weeks before. Lorenzo sat outside her room each night, gun in one hand, glass of whiskey in the other, the firelight flickering across the scars on his knuckles. He told himself he was protecting her out of guilt, that saving her was redemption for the lives he had taken. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Her presence quieted something inside him that violence never could. Years passed like whispers in the dark. Amara grew into a beautiful young woman with fierce eyes and a grace that no tragedy could erase. She studied art, read philosophy, and learned languages. Lorenzo hired private tutors from across Europe, but he also made sure she trained with his men, boxing, knives, marksmanship, because he knew the world he lived in would never spare her softness. The girl who once trembled in his arms was now a warrior in her own right. Every time she sparred, Lorenzo watched from the shadows, pride and fear clashing in his chest. He tried to hide the storm brewing inside him, the guilt of wanting to keep her hidden from the world, the ache that came when she smiled at him, the protectiveness that bordered on obsession. He started staying away from her for days, intending to be consumed by business. But every night he found himself outside her door, listening for her voice, the quiet hum of her lullabies, the faint sound of her laughter drifting from the garden. She painted often, capturing the ocean from her window, the same waves that had mirrored his loneliness all these years. Sometimes he saw her sketching him too, her charcoal tracing the lines of his jaw, the coldness in his eyes softened by something she saw that he couldn't. Once, he asked her why she painted him at all. She smiled and said softly, "Because even fire can have a heart." He had no answer for that, only silence and the weight of everything he didn't dare feel. At night, when sleep refused to come, he sat by the fire remembering the moment he'd found her broken in that alley. The same rain, the same helplessness. It haunted him. She was no longer that child, but in his mind, she would always be the fragile soul he failed to protect from a world that fed on cruelty. He promised himself he would never cross the invisible line between protector and something more. Yet the heart does not listen to rules written in guilt. When she entered a room, his breath faltered. When she laughed, the sound pierced through years of blood and sin. He fought it with everything he had, but love, once awakened, is not easily caged. Victor's network had gone silent since the fire, but Lorenzo knew it was only a matter of time before the storm returned. He doubled the guards, trained Amara to shoot, and never allowed her beyond the villa walls without him. "You're safe here," he would say, and she would nod, not realizing the fear in his voice wasn't for her safety. It was for what he was becoming because of her. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she found him standing by the balcony, cigarette between his fingers. "You're burning inside, Lorenzo," she whispered. "Why won't you let anyone in?" He turned his face away, his jaw tight. "Because the last person I let in never came back out alive." The years hardened them both in different ways. She learned to sign, "Oh, be fearless," and he learned to hide tenderness behind commands. But when their eyes met, the world around them paused. The kind of silence that speaks louder than words. The villa became their sanctuary and their prison. He told himself she was like a daughter, but his heart disagreed. She wasn't blood. She was the redemption he didn't deserve. He could feel the distance between them stretching thinner every day, like a thread about to snap. He stopped calling her kid or little one, replaced it with Amara, spoken softly, reverently, as if her name itself was dangerous. Then came that one night, the stormy one when thunder rolled over the cliffs and wind howled through the corridors. Lorenzo, exhausted and haunted, fell asleep on the couch near her room after hours of pacing. His mind drifted into a dream, one where fire and rain merged, where his past bled into the present. He saw Amara as a child again, reaching for him, whispering, "Papa." Then she was grown, standing before him, eyes full of tears, whispering something he could never let himself believe. "I love you." His lips moved unconsciously, the name slipping out. A prayer, a confession, a curse. Amara. From the doorway, her silhouette froze. She had come to check on him, and heard her name fall from his lips in a whisper that sounded nothing like a father's. The name still echoed in her ears like forbidden music. Amara. It wasn't the way a father whispered his child's name. It was fragile, reverent, full of hunger and pain. Standing at the doorway that night, her heart had skipped 1,000 beats before shattering into quiet realization. She knew what that tone meant. It wasn't supposed to be possible, not after all those years, not after what he had been to her, but the truth had been written in every glance, every silence, every heartbeat they'd shared. By morning, Amara's world had changed, the walls of the villa that once made her feel safe now felt like they were closing in. Every breath she took near him became heavier, every word laced with emotions she was terrified to name. She began avoiding him, hiding in the library, taking her meals alone, and walking the garden paths long after sunset. But love, once awakened, doesn't die quietly. It stays in the air, burning, alive, refusing to be buried beneath duty or fear. Lorenzo felt it too. He tried to drown it in work, in blood, in anything that reminded him of who he used to be before she came into his life. He returned to the underworld meetings, trying to remind himself that he was a boss first, not a man with a trembling heart. But her absence haunted him worse than her presence ever did. The house that once echoed with her laughter now felt like a grave. His men noticed his silence, his shorter temper, his coldness sharpened by something unseen. He was losing control, and for a man like Lorenzo De Luca, control was everything. Still, he couldn't bring himself to confront her. The line between what was right and what was real blurred every time their eyes met. He had fought wars, betrayed kings, and ruled empires, but he couldn't fight this, the love that felt like a sin he didn't want forgiveness for. A week later, the gala arrived. It was supposed to be a simple business affair, a show of strength to remind the city that Lorenzo De Luca was still untouchable. Amara stood in front of the mirror that evening, her reflection trembling between innocence and temptation. The silk gown clung to her like moonlight, her curls cascading down her shoulders, and for a moment she hated herself for wanting his eyes to find her. She wasn't the scared little girl he'd saved. She was a woman now, and her heart belonged to a man who lived in shadows. When Lorenzo saw her enter the ballroom that night, time stopped. Every conversation around him faded. Every light seemed to bend toward her. He forced himself to look away, to mask the chaos inside him behind a smirk and a glass of whiskey. But when another woman, a sleek socialite with red lips and cruel laughter, slid her hand down his arm, Amara felt something snap deep within her chest. She told herself it was childish jealousy, that she had no right to feel it. But when Lorenzo smiled at that woman, a hollow kind of rage filled her veins. The music, the laughter, the glittering chandeliers, all of it blurred. She turned away, her eyes stinging, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Lorenzo noticed the way she left the room, the way her breath trembled and guilt stabbed through him like a blade. He had only smiled to keep suspicion off them, but it had wounded her far deeper than he expected. He excused himself, following her through the corridors of the old mansion where the gala was held. "Amara," he called softly. She stopped but didn't turn. "You shouldn't look at me like that," she whispered, voice breaking, "because I can't stop looking back." He froze. For a moment the world stood still. Just them, standing in a corridor painted with shadows and gold. He wanted to tell her the truth, that she had become the heartbeat he thought he'd lost forever. But before the words could leave his lips, the sound of shattered glass and distant gunfire split the silence. Screams erupted from the ballroom. His instincts took over instantly. He grabbed her wrist, dragging her behind a marble pillar just as masked men in black stormed the room, automatic weapons gleaming beneath the chandelier's broken light. Bullets rained like metal rain, guests scattering like frightened birds. Lorenzo's men fired back, chaos devouring the elegance of the night. He pulled Amara behind him, his gun already in his hand, his voice cold and lethal as he barked orders. "Stay behind me, don't move." But she didn't listen. When one of the assassins aimed directly at him from the balcony above, she saw it before he did. Time slowed, his name formed on her lips, and before he could react, she threw herself forward, the gunshot echoing like thunder. The bullet tore through her shoulder, the force sending her crashing into his arms. He caught her just in time, her blood warm against his trembling hands. "No, no, no, stay with me," he shouted, voice breaking in a way his enemies had never heard. The ballroom blurred into chaos, screams, gunfire, the smell of smoke and blood, but all Lorenzo saw was her. He fired at the shooter with a precision born of rage, dropping him with a single shot before tearing his jacket to press against her wound. "Don't close your eyes, Amara. Look at me," he ordered, his hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. Her lips curved into a faint smile despite the pain, her eyes soft as she reached for his cheek. "You always protect me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But this time, I protected you." Tears burned behind his eyes, the world spinning into madness around them. He lifted her, carrying her through the back exit as his men covered their retreat. The night air outside was cold, but his heart burned with panic and fury. In the car, as they sped through the city streets, Lorenzo held her hand against his chest, feeling her pulse weaken beneath his fingers. Memories flooded him, the first night he'd found her, the promise he'd made to never let her get hurt again. "Don't talk," he whispered, voice raw. "You're going to be fine, do you hear me? You're not leaving me." But she only smiled weakly, her eyelids fluttering. "Don't lose me. Again," she breathed, the words ghosting against his skin before darkness claimed her. Lorenzo's breath shattered as the heart monitor flatlined in the speeding car, Amara's pulse fading beneath his blood-stained hands. The world inside the car had stopped breathing. The heart monitor screamed its merciless tone, and Lorenzo's pulse roared in his ears like a storm trying to drown out death itself. Amara's body lay limp in his arms, her blood soaking through his shirt, painting his soul in guilt all over again. "No, not again," he rasped, his voice raw, trembling between rage and terror. The driver's eyes met his through the mirror, filled with silent dread, but Lorenzo's stare froze him into silence. The convoy sped through the rain-slicked streets, headlights cutting through the night like knives. When they reached his private hospital, his men were already waiting, dragging open the doors as Lorenzo carried Amara inside himself. "If she dies," he snarled at the doctor, his voice shaking with fury, "you'll wish you were never born." He didn't leave her side until the machines began to hum in rhythm with her weak heartbeat. But that sound didn't calm him. It only fanned the fire in his veins. He turned away, his jaw locked, his soul unraveling. For years he'd kept the beast inside chained, but the moment her blood touched his hands again, the chains snapped. The next morning, the city bled. Lorenzo De Luca, the man whispered about in every shadow, unleashed hell. His soldiers moved like ghosts through Viktor Malenkov's territories. No mercy, no warnings, only bodies left in their wake. Warehouses burned, money houses exploded, and the men who had smiled in Victor's name now begged for lives they'd stolen from others. Lorenzo didn't flinch. He killed with precision, with purpose, with pain that came from somewhere too deep to name. Every gunshot was a heartbeat he refused to lose again. Every scream an echo of Amara's fading breath. He hunted Victor's men one by one, burning their empire to the ground. The police, politicians, and rival families watched from the shadows as the DeLuca name turned from legend to nightmare. Rain fell again, just like the night he found her years ago. Lorenzo stood before the last of Victor's strongholds, a derelict factory at the city's edge. He had already sent his men away, choosing to walk into the lion's den alone. The guards opened fire as he advanced, but bullets didn't stop it. He moved like death in a tailored suit, silent, unrelenting, a god of vengeance sculpted from ash and agony. When he reached Victor at last, the man was cornered, trembling, sweat glistening on his pale skin. "You wanted her," Lorenzo growled, his gun leveled between Victor's eyes. "Now you can explain yourself to the devil." The shot echoed once, and then silence swallowed the room. By the time the flames consumed the factory, Lorenzo was already gone, his shadow melting into the night. Back in the hospital, Amara's body fought its own war. Machines breathed for her, tubes fed her, and the doctors whispered their grim predictions in the hallway. The woman who once learned to fight from the Mafia's fiercest now lay between life and death again, her spirit refusing to let go. Every time her heart faltered, memories rose, his voice telling her to stay, his eyes burning through the darkness, the promise he never spoke but always kept. Her dreams were full of fire and thunder, of a man drenched in blood walking away from the flames. Sometimes she thought she heard him whisper, "Live, Amara, live, even if I can't." Days turned into weeks, and the city slowly learned to fear the quiet. Rumors spread. Victor's empire had vanished overnight, his entire bloodline erased. The underworld whispered one name, Lorenzo DeLuca, the devil who had traded his humanity for vengeance. But even devils bleed. When Amara finally opened her eyes, sunlight spilled across her bed, soft and unfamiliar. The nurse gasped and called the doctor, and for the first time in months, hope filled the sterile air. But as her gaze wandered around the room, she saw emptiness where he should have been. The chair beside her bed was vacant, the whiskey glass gone, the faint scent of his cologne faded into memory. On the nightstand lay a single folded note, the paper stained faintly with blood and rain. Her trembling fingers opened it, her breath catching as she read his handwriting, sharp, elegant, heartbreak carved into every stroke. "To protect you, I must destroy the monster I became." Tears blurred the ink as she clutched the letter to her chest. The world outside moved on, but inside her, time stopped. He had vanished from her life like smoke. No trace, no word, only silence. She searched for him for months, reaching out to his men, but even they didn't know where he'd gone. Some said he'd gone underground, others whispered he'd gone mad. Only Amara believed that he was still out there, watching from the shadows, protecting her from a distance. A year passed. The seasons changed, and the villa that once echoed with his voice became her sanctuary. She ran the DeLuca businesses he'd left behind, turning them into charities and rebuilding what violence had broken. Yet every night, she stood by the balcony, staring at the ocean that had always carried his reflection. Her dreams were full of him, his hands, his voice, the way he'd looked at her that night before the gunfire. Love had turned into a ghost that refused to leave her. Then one morning, as she sipped her coffee and the television flickered across the quiet living room, the news anchor's words sliced through her world like a blade. Breaking news, Mafia boss Lorenzo DeLuca presumed dead after a massive explosion at the docks last night. Her cup fell from her hand, shattering on the floor. Images filled the screen, flames rising high into the sky, pieces of blackened metal scattered across the water, a single gold ring pulled from the wreckage. Her breath caught. Her fingers touched her lips, trembling. The man who saved her life, the man she loved, the man she would have died for, gone again. this time to the grave the world built for him. As the screen faded to black, a security camera deep in the ruins captured a shadow limping through the fire. Lorenzo De Luca, alive, his eyes burning with vengeance once more. The fire that had swallowed Lorenzo De Luca's name burned through every headline, every whisper in the criminal underworld. But for Amara, it wasn't an ending. It was a wound that refused to close. For a year, she moved through life like a ghost wearing the mask of strength. The empire he'd built, in blood now rested in her hands, and she turned it into something he could have been proud of. The money that once bought bullets now fed orphans, the warehouses that once hid guns now stored food for the hungry. She became a quiet force of redemption in a world that had only ever known destruction. Yet behind her calm, her soul ached with the weight of one question: what if he wasn't truly gone? Rumors whispered through the alleys of Naples and the docks of Marseille, stories of a man who matched Lorenzo's face, living like a shadow beneath a different name. She told herself not to believe them, but hope has a way of surviving where logic dies. One night, sitting in her office surrounded by ledgers and silence, she saw it, a blurred photograph on a smuggler's report. A man with familiar blue-gray eyes feeding dogs by a broken fountain in a coastal Italian town. Her heart stopped. The image was grainy, but the way he held himself, the tilt of his head, the loneliness in his stance, was unmistakable. It was him. She booked a flight within hours, her heart pounding like it had the night he'd bled in her arms. The plane touched down in southern Italy under a pale sunrise, painting the hills gold and crimson. The village was small, the kind of place time forgot. Cobblestone streets, sea wind carrying the scent of salt and lemons, and old men playing cards outside taverns. Every step she took felt like a heartbeat closer to him. She followed the faint trails of gossip, the quiet foreigner who kept to himself, the man who limped slightly when it rained, who spoke little and fed stray dogs by the cliffside every evening. Her stomach twisted with fear and longing, every emotion clashing like storms inside her chest. When she reached the crumbling steps leading to the fountain, she saw him. He was thinner, his face rough with scars that hadn't been there before, and his once polished aura of power replaced by weary solitude. He wore simple clothes, a faded shirt, worn boots, and his hair was longer, streaked with gray near the temples. But it was him, her Lorenzo, the man she had buried 100 times in her dreams, standing alive before her, feeding scraps of bread to a trembling stray dog. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The world blurred. The waves, the gulls, the cobblestones, all of it vanished beneath the weight of the sight before her. She stepped closer, her voice breaking as she whispered his name. Lorenzo. He froze. The bag of bread fell from his hand, and for the briefest second the mask slipped. His eyes flickered with something raw, painful, unmistakably human. Then he turned away. "You're mistaken," he said, his voice low, deeper, roughened by time and guilt. "The man you're looking for died a long time ago." She moved closer, trembling. "You can lie to the world, Lorenzo, but not to me." He didn't look at her, didn't dare. His hands clenched, his body rigid, every muscle warring against the gravity pulling him back to her. The wind tangled through her hair as she whispered, "I waited for you. I built your world into something better because I thought it's what you wanted." He finally turned, eyes hard as stone, but wet with ghosts. "What I wanted doesn't matter. What I was destroys everything it touches." She shook her head, tears spilling. "You didn't destroy me, you saved me." His laugh was bitter, broken. "And in saving you, I damned myself." He stepped back, each word slicing through the air like a blade. "You need to forget me, Amara. The man you love doesn't exist anymore." Then, without another word, he walked away down the narrow street, his shadow melting into the dying light. She wanted to scream, to chase after him, to pull him back from the void he'd chosen, but her legs gave out. She sank to her knees by the fountain, her tears falling into the same water where he had once fed the strays. The sky darkened, and the sea below crashed harder, as if mourning alongside her. Hours passed. She sat there long, after he was gone, clutching the silver chain he had once given her, the only proof that love had ever existed between monsters and miracles. She didn't notice the black car watching from the end of the street, the men inside smoking in silence, eyes locked on her. When she finally rose and began walking back toward her small inn near the pier, the feeling of being watched crawled up her spine. She dismissed it as paranoia, born from the heartbreak still bleeding inside her. But fate doesn't wait for wounds to heal. It strikes where the heart is most exposed. That night, as rain whispered against the roof and thunder rolled over the horizon, Amara stared out her window at the restless sea. Every memory of him replayed like an old film: the alley, the fire, the first time he smiled at her, the way he'd whispered her name like a secret prayer. "Why did you leave me again?" she murmured to the night. Lightning flashed, illuminating a shadow behind her, too still to be her reflection. Before she could turn, a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. Her scream was swallowed by the storm as two masked men dragged her from the window, the sound of splintering wood mixing with the thunder's growl. She fought, kicking, clawing, her training igniting, but the needle that pierced her arm numbed her body within seconds. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the tattoo on one man's wrist, a serpent coiled around a dagger. She knew that symbol. Victor's surviving brother stepped from the shadows of the waiting van, his grin cold as he whispered, "Let's see if your ghost still bleeds when I take his heart." The news of Amara's abduction reached Lorenzo like the echo of a gunshot in the hollow of his soul, a sound that split the man he'd tried to become from the monster he'd buried beneath ashes and guilt. For a year he had lived in silence, hiding behind false names and sunlight. Mornings, pretending the blood on his hands could be washed away by feeding stray dogs and mending boats for fishermen who didn't know his past. But when he saw her picture flash across an underground channel, bound, bruised, and trembling beneath the insignia of the Malenkov crest, something inside him detonated. The devil was back. Lorenzo De Luca, the name whispered in fear across continents, breathed again like fire finding oxygen. That night, Italy's skies burned red as he reopened the vault that held his old weapons, tailored suit, and engraved gun that still carried the scent of vengeance. His men, scattered and in hiding, came crawling back from the shadows the moment they heard his call, each one knowing that their boss had risen from the grave. The man who had once torn empires apart with bare hands now moved with silent purpose, his blue eyes no longer cold but ablaze with something more dangerous: love turned wrath. The rain fell like bullets as he drove through the coastal roads toward Victor's brother's fortress, headlights slicing through mist and memory alike. Every turn was haunted by Amara's voice, soft, trembling, calling him Papa in a hospital bed years ago, and now, in his mind, calling for help again. He felt the familiar chill of violence coating his veins, a dark comfort that whispered, "You were never meant to be good, Lorenzo. You were born to destroy." The fortress loomed like a beast carved from rock, its walls guarded by men who thought they understood fear. They didn't. The first to spot him barely had time to shout before Lorenzo's bullet shattered the silence. Blood misted the air, thunder growled overhead, and the legend of De Luca's resurrection spread through the compound like wildfire. One by one they fell, his movements precise, surgical, almost graceful in their brutality. He slit throats under flickering lights, crushed skulls against steel beams, his rage quiet and controlled, like an artist painting death in deliberate strokes. Inside, Amara sat tied to a chair, her lips trembling as she whispered prayers into the darkness. Her captor, Victor's brother, Ivan, smirked as he circled her, the scent of whiskey heavy on his breath. "He's not coming, little girl," he sneered, gripping her chin. "The great Lorenzo De Luca is dead." But then the lights went out. A single gunshot echoed, followed by another and another, each closer than the last. Screams replaced laughter. The air grew thick with smoke, the walls trembled from detonations, and Ivan's confidence shattered when the steel door burst open. Lorenzo stepped through the fire like something dragged up from hell itself, blood-smeared, rain-soaked, his expression colder than stone. "You should have stayed in your brother's grave," he muttered. Ivan fired wildly, but Lorenzo moved faster than fury, the bullets grazing his coat as he closed the distance. One punch cracked Ivan's jaw. Another drove him into the wall. The man begged for mercy, but Lorenzo had none left to give. "You touched what's mine," he whispered, before pressing the gun to his forehead and pulling the trigger. The thunder outside swallowed the sound, as though the heavens themselves refused to echo such wrath. Amara gasped as he turned toward her, her tears cutting streaks through the grime on her face. "Lorenzo," she breathed, disbelief and relief colliding in her chest. He knelt before her, cutting her ropes with trembling hands. For a moment, she saw not the monster, but the man who had once carried her out of darkness. His hands brushed her bruises softly, eyes glimmering with something too human for a devil. "I told you I'd protect you," he said quietly, but Amara stepped back, chest heaving, anger shaking through her body. "Protect me?" she cried. "You left me, Lorenzo. You let me think you were dead. You let me drown in a world that hated me without you." Her voice cracked, every word slicing through the silence like shards of glass. Lorenzo's face twisted with pain. "Hey," his jaw tightening as he tried to speak, but the words failed him. He had faced bullets, blades, betrayal, but nothing wounded him like the sight of her tears. "I thought leaving would keep you safe," he finally said, his voice raw. "Every man who stands near me ends up buried. I couldn't risk that with you." She shook her head, rain mixing with her tears. "You don't get to decide what hurts me," she whispered, voice trembling with heartbreak and defiance. "You said you'd never leave me again, and you did. You destroyed me, Lorenzo." The storm raged around them, lightning flashing across his scarred face as he stepped closer, his breath shallow. "Then hate me," he whispered, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "But you'll live." He turned away, blood dripping from his knuckles, his silhouette framed by fire and rain. A man damned by love, redeemed by the one thing he could never have. As Amara collapsed to her knees, sobbing his name, a red laser dot slowly appeared on Lorenzo's chest from the rooftop, followed by the sound of a sniper's rifle being cocked. The forest swallowed them whole as they fled into the mountains, their breaths ragged, hearts pounding in rhythm with the rain that refused to stop since that cursed night. Lorenzo's blood painted a trail behind them, but Amara didn't care. Her only focus was keeping him alive. They reached an old stone safe house buried between jagged cliffs, a relic from his past wars, a place even death itself would hesitate to visit. Inside, the silence was suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of fire and the distant thunder echoing like ghosts beating on the walls of fate. Amara knelt beside him, trembling as she peeled away his blood-soaked shirt. The bullet had grazed his chest, burning flesh and pride alike. Her hands shook as she pressed a cloth to the wound, whispering, "Stay with me, please." Her tears fell onto his skin, each drop heavier than any storm. Lorenzo stared at her through half-lidded eyes, the world blurring into colors of pain and memory. She looked so much like the hope he'd buried, his heart's forbidden resurrection wrapped in trembling innocence and stubborn strength. Days melted into nights in that cabin, trapped between the howl of the wind and the silence between their hearts. They barely spoke. Sometimes she cooked, sometimes he patched the broken window, but mostly they just existed, breathing in the same space, yet separated by guilt and longing. Every time their eyes met, something unspoken flickered between them, dangerous, electric, and aching. At night, she'd hear him pacing outside, murmuring curses into the wind, his demons clawing to break free. Once she caught him standing in the doorway, watching her sleep, his hand hovering near her face before he tore himself away, whispering, "Don't make me sin, Amara." She didn't understand how love could feel like both warmth and destruction until now. One evening, a storm tore through the valley, lightning painting the sky in fire. Lorenzo sat shirtless near the fire, cleaning his gun, his scars glowing under the flicker of flames. Amara approached, clutching a towel, her voice soft but firm. "Let me change your bandage," she said. He didn't protest. When her fingers brushed his skin, he flinched, not from pain, but from the way her touch burned through his armor. Her hands trembled, tracing the path of the wound, and when he caught her wrist, their eyes locked, the world stilled. "Why are you doing this?" he rasped. "You should have left when you had the chance." She swallowed hard. "Because I can't. Because every time I breathe, I hear your name." He turned away, the weight of her words breaking something inside him. "Don't," he warned, voice trembling between desire and despair. "You don't know what I am." She stepped closer, defiant. "I know exactly who you are, Lorenzo, and I don't care." His composure cracked, years of restraint collapsing under the pressure of a single moment. He grabbed her face, his thumb brushing the tear from her cheek, his eyes dark and shattered. "You were my salvation, Amara," he whispered, his voice breaking like glass, "but I don't deserve you." And before she could reply, she closed the distance herself, pressing her lips against his in a kiss that tasted like blood, rain, and everything they'd both denied. It wasn't gentle, it was desperate, trembling, a collision of love and sin. His hands slid into her hair as she melted against him, both of them lost in the chaos of everything they'd tried to bury. The fire crackled louder, the storm howled harder, and for the first time in years, Lorenzo felt alive. But love born from ruin is always hunted by fate. Before dawn, a noise shattered the fragile peace. The sound of gravel crunching beneath boots, the click of safety catches being released. Lorenzo's instincts flared like lightning. He grabbed Amara and pushed her to the ground just as the first bullet shattered the window. Glass exploded across the room, sparks raining from the fireplace as chaos erupted. "Down!" he shouted, rolling behind the overturned table. Amara's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she crawled toward him, terror gripping her throat. Outside, the valley filled with the roar of engines, Victor's men, more than a dozen, their silhouettes ghost-like in the rain. Lorenzo fired back, each shot finding its mark, his body moving like a shadow of the devil she'd seen that night in the fortress. "They found us," she whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. He glanced at her, his eyes softer for a fleeting second. "I promised I'd keep you safe, even if it kills me." She shook her head violently. "No, I can't lose you again." But her words were drowned out by the explosion of gunfire. Bullets ripped through walls, flames crawled up the curtains, and smoke thickened the air until it choked every breath. Lorenzo coughed, blood seeping through his bandage again, yet he refused to stop. He moved with precision, like a man who had already accepted death. He shot the last man at the door before turning back toward her, his voice hoarse. "Run, Amara." She shook her head, frozen in terror, watching the world collapse around them. He reached for her, but before their fingers could meet, another shot rang out, a deafening crack that cut through the storm. Lorenzo staggered, eyes wide, as the red bloom spread across his chest. The gun fell from his hand. Amara screamed, the sound raw enough to tear heaven apart as he collapsed into the smoke. Amara crawled to his body, shaking him violently, crying his name, but his eyes were closing, and his last whisper was, "You were my peace." Then his hand fell limp against hers. The world returned to Lorenzo not in flashes of light, but through the soft rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't his own. It echoed faintly, like music through water, pulling him from the suffocating dark. His eyelids fluttered open to the sterile whiteness of a hospital room, the steady beep of a monitor keeping time with his fragile breath. The air smelled of antiseptic and rain, the kind that follows destruction. His chest ached, wrapped in gauze, each inhale a reminder that he should have been dead. But then he felt it, warmth against his hand. When he turned his head, the first thing he saw wasn't the pain or the wires or the ceiling. It was her, Amara. Her head rested against the mattress, her hair tumbling over her face, her fingers wrapped around his with desperate tenderness. She had dark circles beneath her eyes, exhaustion etched into her every movement. But when she felt him stir, she lifted her gaze, and in that moment, everything he'd ever lost came back to him. "Lorenzo," she breathed, her voice trembling like a prayer finally answered. He tried to speak, but his throat burned. She pressed her fingers to his lips. Don't. Just breathe. You scared me. A tear slid down her cheek, falling onto his hand, and he stared at it like it was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. Later, the doctor came, explaining how close he'd been to the edge, that the bullet had missed his heart by a whisper. You wouldn't have made it, he said, if not for her. Lorenzo frowned weakly. What did she do? The doctor smiled faintly. She gave you her blood, literally, same type. She refused to rest until the transfusion was done. Lorenzo turned his head toward her again, his eyes glistening with something too raw to hide. Amara looked down, brushing invisible dust from the blanket, embarrassed by the truth. You saved me, he whispered, voice breaking. After everything I've done, you still saved me. She leaned closer, resting her forehead against his. You saved me first, she said softly. Now we're even. The days that followed were slow but healing. He learned to walk again, leaning on her arm, feeling the warmth of her presence fill the cold space inside him that power and blood had never touched. Sometimes they sat in silence, watching the sun rise through the window, both of them understanding what words could never express, that love had dragged them through hell only to make them worthy of peace. When Lorenzo was strong enough, he called his remaining men and dismantled everything, every account, every shipment, every trace of the DeLuca Empire. No one touches her, he ordered. No one follows us. The Mafia dies with me. The men who once feared him now bowed in silent respect, seeing in their boss not a king, but a man finally free. A week later, Amara wheeled him out of the hospital. The world outside smelled of salt and sunlight, and for the first time in years, Lorenzo inhaled without guilt. They didn't speak as they crossed the border, slipping into a quiet life far from the shadows that had shaped them. In a small coastal town, they rented a house by the sea, its walls painted white and peaceful. She started planting flowers in the garden, roses, lilies, and tiny wild blooms that danced with the wind. Lorenzo built boats again, hands steady and honest. Sometimes at night, he'd wake up and watch her sleeping beside him, moonlight tracing the curve of her face, and he'd whisper, I don't deserve you. Only for her to murmur in her sleep, you do now. Months later, when his scars had faded into pale reminders, Lorenzo asked her to walk with him. They drove to the city, the one they'd both left behind, where pain had been born and love had been tested. The rain began as they entered the alley, that same forgotten corner where years ago he had found a broken little girl lying in the mud, clutching life with trembling fingers. Now the same alley glowed with lamplight and new life. The puddles reflected the neon from passing cars, and for a moment he saw that child again, then blinked and saw only her. Amara, grown, beautiful, strong. She smiled softly. Strange, she said, brushing her fingers along the brick wall. This place used to feel like the end of the world. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. Now it's where it all began. She turned, eyes glimmering with tears and laughter. Do you ever regret saving me? She whispered. He shook his head, his lips brushing her forehead. No. Saving you was the first right thing I ever did. They stood there as the rain fell again, washing away the ghosts of their past, leaving only the warmth of their shared breath and the quiet beat of two hearts that had finally found peace. Years of chaos had brought them here, not as boss and victim, not as sinner and saint, but as two souls reborn from the ashes of pain. Lorenzo DeLuca, the man who once ruled through fear, now held peace in his hands, and Amara, the girl who once cried for help, had become his reason to live. Together, they walked toward the end of the alley, where the street opened into light. Their footsteps faded into the sound of the rain, their shadows merging as one. She was the child he saved, and the woman who saved him back.